It's Friday, March 22nd. Let's talk PlayStation. Starting off, here's your weekly reminder for your PlayStation Plus games for the month of March 2019. It is Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered and The Witness. You have until April 1st to download these games. Now, for our first news story, Sony revealed a new variant color of the DualShock 4 earlier in the week. It is Alpine Green, very cool looking controller. You know, a lot of people saw this and it reminds them of the football team, the Eagles, but to be honest, I vacationed in the state of Vermont last year, and now the second I saw that controller, I was like, Vermont. Those are the colors of that controller for sure. But moving on to a patent that recently surfaced, it shows PlayStation VR being completely wireless. And so in the description of the patent, it gets very technical, of course, but it's basically describing wireless technology to make sure the latency and motion tracking is all well and good without any actual hard wires being connected to from the VR to the actual breakout box and then PlayStation 4. And the imagery does show a PS4 and the current design of PlayStation VR, but you would assume that maybe this is something Sony's exploring for much later because we're not quite there just yet. I mean, sure, it's possible, but it makes the tech very expensive, and Sony, of course, as a console manufacturer, wants to make very price point accessible hardware, so this might be something that's more long-term, but it's very good to know that Sony's definitely exploring completely wireless virtual reality. Sony said it time and time again that the current PlayStation VR is a hardware 1 type device, and it will take many iterations to get to where we want to be. Now, of course, we have to talk about this. It's far too interesting to ignore in terms of the future of the video game industry, and so if you didn't see earlier this week at GDC, Google officially unveiled their streaming platform, which is called Stadia. Stadia being kind of a play off words of the word stadium. Stadium, you know, you go to a stadium for a live sporting event. Well, they want this to be the epicenter of where you'd go to play video games on the computer, on your phone, what have you. And that's the quick recap, is that this is a streaming service, a cloud gaming service where you play it on Google Chrome, off of Chromecast, Android phones. They didn't specifically mention iOS devices. I'm sure that would come at some point. But pretty much, you know, on Google services and whatnot. And it's very accessible. A few standout features is, you know, jumping right into a game when you're watching on YouTube, for example. If you're watching a walkthrough, you could start playing that game immediately from the point at which you're watching the video. If somebody's streaming the game, there's a play button to where you can get into a queue to play with the streamer. So they're kind of going all out. Google's very much so being very aggressive. And the big difference some people don't understand about this service is that it's its own platform. It's not its own hardware, but it is its own hardware. On the server side of where you'd actually be playing the game and streaming it off of, it is its own unique little box, more or less. It's 10.7 teraflops for the GPU, which is quite powerful. PS4 Pro is around 4.2, and Xbox One X is around 6 teraflops. It's an x86 architecture. If developers want to release a game on Stadia, they're very much so porting the game to Stadia. They can't just let the game be out, right? This is very much its own separate platform. And so that's the big question mark with this service right now. More than anything else is the developer support, who's going to be on this thing. Google didn't get into any specifics about that. They certainly didn't talk about price. What they did tell us is about the internet requirements, and right there is kind of where it's a big turnoff for some people. Now, already people don't want to stream their video games, but if you want to get a very clear 1080p 60 frames per second, you have to have at least 25 megabytes down, which, I don't know, to me seems very demanding. I actually don't get that. I have to call my service provider actually somewhat soon because I'm pretty pissed because I'm paying so much, and I'm getting like 10 down, which is ridiculous, and I'm paying for 100. But that's like the issue, right? Is that for every one person that's paying for 100 down and they're getting 100 down, there's like 5 other people that just are getting terrible service. You know, the internet infrastructure is just not there. And it's interesting because I've gone through perhaps thousands of comments to try to gauge where people sit with this. I'm checking a lot of different surveys on a lot of different websites, and it's very mixed. You know, depending on where you go, people are very for this or people are very against it. And I just think it's too early. It's still a bit too early because Google's going all in on the streaming, mind you. Whereas Microsoft and Sony are taking a half and half approach, where they're very much so next generation still going to release a traditional box. But Microsoft, for example, working on Project xCloud. They're testing it right now. There's going to be a beta later this year, more than likely. They're doing a digital Xbox One S next month, more than likely, if rumors are to be believed. PlayStation Now, of course, very relevant, semi-relevant still, as it's the #1 streaming service right now currently, and Sony has a pretty good advantage based off the fact that they have 700 games in their library, and you're more or less just playing them off PlayStation 3s, PlayStation 4s, and what have you. Sony's more than likely going to pursue PlayStation Now even further. So it's kind of all coming to a head. And now it's just a matter of, does Google have a place in the games industry? Now, at the press conference, Phil Harrison is actually heading Google Stadia. Now, Phil Harrison is actually ex-Sony Computer Entertainment Europe from a long time ago. He was one of the guys that had to do a lot of PR damage control for PlayStation 3 back in 2006. Then he went to Microsoft. Then he left Microsoft to go to Stadia. They've also got Jade Raymond heading the Google Studio. So Google actually is starting a first-party game development studio as well for exclusives, which they pretty much need, but that's one studio. And I can't imagine, even if it's a 400 or 500 plus staff studio, I mean, the fact of the matter is Google's just going to have a service that's completely doing third-party games up until they have one or two, maybe a handful of exclusives, unless they get very aggressive with second-party deals, which I'm sure they might try to do. This is just one of those things where it very much so reminds me of Google Plus, which is that, yes, Google is massive. They have tons of capital. If any company out there could try to squeeze their way into the games industry as a fourth platform holder next to, say, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, it would be Google because they have that capital. But you know, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You just can't convince consumers to use your product. That's kind of like the Google Plus scenario. It's like, oh, when Google Plus kind of came out, it's like, oh, well, you know, everybody's going to leave Facebook, this and that. Everybody's kind of talking these crazy things like, oh, Google's got the money to do it. You just can't convince people. If people don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. And I just think it's still too soon for the streaming thing. So if they're going all in on streaming, I mean, how committed are they going to be? 25 down is a pretty big requirement, I feel, for a vast majority of people. So it seems like they're getting into the game very early. Now, that's fine if they're going to stick to it, but will they stick to it? Or will this just be another thing that they're throwing against the wall to see what sticks? I don't know. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, but I'm not totally convinced, especially given the fact that people aren't just going to up and leave online ecosystems, like their trophies, their Xbox Live friends, their download history, assuming that, say, PS5 or Xbox, the next generation Scarlet consoles for Xbox are fully backwards compatible. So you have all those online purchases that were, say, either digital or DLC or what have you, all can just get transferred and re-downloaded over to your new box. And then all of a sudden, say, Microsoft and Sony work out a way where all those discs from previous consoles still work, which, based on current rumors, that is where we're going. So it's like Sony and Microsoft and even Nintendo have this legacy of games, so it's going to be very hard to convince those people to leave. While at the same time, PC's doing so well, a lot of people are enjoying PC gaming, and so certainly your typical PC gamer would very much so try Stadia because it's just very accessible. When you can just play it instantly from a Chrome browser, that's about as accessible as it gets. And so I certainly see the appeal. It's very impressive, but it's going to be a tough sell, I think, for Stadia. And we'll talk more about them when we get more details this summer, which is when Google will actually be informing us more about, say, how many developers are on board, how many titles the service might actually launch with, and certainly the pricing. All right, so now let's get to our next news story. It's about Death Stranding. Nothing big, basically, but Norman Reedus, Hideo Kojima, and Jeff Keighley will be at the Tribeca Film Festival doing a little hour talk on April 25th. No big deal, but it might be one of those situations where we find something a little bit interesting out of the game. They're going to talk about the relationship between Norman and Hideo working on Death Stranding and how they're kind of cultivating this approach to this game. Jeff Keighley will be kind of hosting the event and possibly taking questions from the crowd or something like that. So just keep that in mind. There might be something very cool that comes out of that discussion. This is also a very quick news story, but on PlayStation Vue on Apple TV, you can actually get 4 simultaneous streams now. This was a recent update, which actually makes this better on Apple TV than it does on an actual PlayStation 4, because I believe on a PlayStation 4, when you're using PlayStation Vue, you can only get 3 simultaneous streams, which is fine, certainly, but if you are really into sports or something like that, it's better watched on an Apple TV so you can get 4 live games going. So just an FYI, Sony's updating the Apple TV to make it a little bit better than the PS4 version. I'm sure they might have data suggesting that a lot of people are using it on Apple TV, so they're pushing out updates quicker on that platform rather than their own hardware. But I would presume that PS4, it won't take that long for the app to be updated on PS4 to also get those 4 simultaneous streams. Now, file this one under a very big rumor, but over on the PS4 Reddit board, somebody posted a picture of this, which is a very fuzzy off-screen shot of the PlayStation Store, and as you can see, EA Access is on there. I believe it's in Portuguese, and it says EA Access available now, and there's a little bit of speculation saying, oh, it was from a friend group or something like that, and they don't know if clicking the link actually goes to anything or what have you. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is true or it's going to happen, because it is kind of one of those BS rumors where it's like take it with a very small grain of salt, especially when it's one of those fuzzy off-camera like shots. But it does kind of echo what we heard about maybe a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months back, which is that EA said they are bringing EA Access to another major platform, and it's probably PlayStation 4. And 2 years back, Sony said that they weren't really interested in having EA Access because it kind of wouldn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of PlayStation Plus and PlayStation Now, but I'm sure they're open to it now, having the service on there. And so it's probably PS4, so maybe it'll come in the short term. Maybe it won't take too long for EA to actually announce this. I mean, the thing about EA Access is that if you are the kind of person that plays the yearly released sports games, even 1 or 2 of them, or even if you like the, say, 10-hour kind of free trials that you get with EA games that EA Access does offer, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad deal whatsoever, and you still have access to about, I don't know, it's 30, 40, 50 some odd EA titles. Most of them are sports games. But again, if you're playing 1 or 2 of those yearly releases, it basically pays for itself within a few months, more or less. So not a bad deal. And if it comes to PS4, I think that would be not too bad of an option for people that are into those games. But moving on, somebody on Twitter asked Colin Moriarty, who was previously of IGN and Kind of Funny and now doing Colin's Last Stand, they asked him if he feels that Sony will add more first-party studios, to which he responded saying, well, you know, they're doing more second-party stuff, but he did say that there's still a substantial second-party game that has not been announced just yet. Now, I wouldn't consider this a rumor. Colin worked in the games industry for pretty much most of his life, and he has very good personal connections with a lot of people in the games industry, so he certainly knows about whatever this game is. It's not fake, it's not a rumor or anything of that sort. It's just a matter of what it possibly is. He's saying fairly substantial, which kind of makes it seem like it's not that big of a game, but it's still big enough to where it causes a lot of buzz. So that's why some people are kind of speculating that maybe it's a Bloodborne 2 or the Demon's Souls remaster, which certainly would be a second-party exclusive, and same with Bloodborne. But I don't necessarily think it's... I think it could be something else. I don't know. I don't even want to take a shot in the dark in terms of what it is. It's probably something that will be announced within the next 6 months to a year. I mean, it can't be that important to the point where it would be released close to, say, a PS5 announcement or close to Ghost of Tsushima, Death Stranding, and Last of Us Part 2. It's certainly not to the level of those games, so this game is probably something that's more to the end life cycle of PS4 that would probably be released in 2020. So that's why I'm like, it's probably not that big of a game. Maybe it's the Demon's Souls remaster, but I don't know. But we'll see whatever it is whenever it decides to turn up. So, do you remember this game? It's called WALD. It was announced back in 2014 during Gamescom, presumably a PS4 exclusive that Sony was publishing, and we didn't really hear much about it ever since. It was supposed to be a survival game in the wilderness. It takes place like 10,000 years into the past, with foraging, scavenging, hunting animals, things like that. It looked pretty cool. A lot of people were interested in it, but they were wondering where this game went. We haven't heard about it in such a long time. I think the last update was about 1 or 2 years ago where the developer said, yes, we're still working on it. And I feel like some people maybe didn't take his word for that, and the game was just silently canceled more or less because we never got any new footage or anything like that. Well, Sony recently filed new trademarks for the game, which pretty much tells you that they're still holding on to it, and they didn't break off that partnership or anything like that, which is good news. But it may be a scenario where, because we haven't seen it in so long, 4 years is a pretty substantial amount of time to where you're not seeing any new trailers or any new footage. In a situation like that, something substantial might have happened where development might have been restarted, or certain assets were completely changed over, maybe mechanics were completely redone. There was something happened to where this game maybe doesn't look like the original footage we've seen before. That's usually the case in situations like this. We'll have to see once the game actually gets a formal re-reveal, which it probably would get, I would assume, at some point. But it's nice to see that the game actually is still coming, actually. Now, boy, oh boy, this is kind of a big deal, and I'm really shocked that more people aren't talking about this, given what it could mean for Sony and how they conduct their business in the future. But the 3 previous PlayStation exclusives, Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human, are all going to PC via the Epic Games Storefront. Now, that's timed exclusive on Epic Games Storefront, so presumably after a year or so, it might go to Steam or Origin or, I don't know, wherever it might end up going. But PC for Detroit, Beyond Two Souls, Heavy Rain. I don't think people are really understanding what's going on here, because they're going, oh, well, Quantic Dream, second-party developer, they own those games, and Sony just published them. No, Sony owns the IP to those games. Those are their properties. They own Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and the recent PS4 exclusive, Detroit Become Human. That's a major PS4 exclusive. It didn't do bad. It sold over 2 million copies. Major headlining game that was always, at their press conferences, trailers, a lot of marketing went behind that game. I mean, and it was received very well. and now just a year later they're putting it on PC. It's really polarizing. I mean, if you go to the Epic Games storefront, even on the very bottom, very much so, Sony Interactive Entertainment is listed under there as the trademark holder for this game. Now, Quantic Dream did announce recently that they're going multi-platform. We talked about that. They got a stake minority investment from NetEase, which is a Chinese video game publisher, and you know, they're getting that funding so that they can comfortably release on multiple platforms for whatever their next original IP is. But for these previous 3 IP that Quantic Dream did and working with PlayStation exclusively for so long, I mean, what you have to understand is this was definitely a discussion between NetEase, Quantic Dream, and Sony, because Sony owns these games. Sony allowed these games to go to PC. That's the big implication here. So what does this really mean? I think it's Sony testing the waters with much larger games, because they're no stranger to releasing their games on PC. They've actually natively ported a few smaller scale PSN titles to PC. Of course, PlayStation Now available on PC. You can stream PlayStation games on a computer, and you know, those are PS4 games as well, and there's some PS4 exclusives on there. So in theory, you don't need a PS4 to play some recently released PS4 exclusives. Not major ones, certainly, but you know, there's a vast library on there where you don't need a PlayStation 4 to play some of these PlayStation exclusives. But to see these games natively ported, I think is Sony testing the waters with a larger IP. And, you know, I think it's a situation where they might deem these games the perfect test bed. They wouldn't ever really do this, I think, certainly in the short term, with a big title like, say, God of War, or The Last of Us, or Uncharted, where it's a native port over to PC. But I think Detroit, Heavy Rain, Beyond, I think those are games that are in that good test the waters scenario, where it's like there's a lot of demand for people to play these games. Certainly if you release them on another platform, they're gonna make money. It's interesting where we're really going here. We're seeing so much crossover with these platform holders just not caring about hardware and just doubling down on software sales and subscription services. I mean, it's not surprising, certainly, but it's certainly wild to see Sony, for example, take the first steps into playing around with that idea of not necessarily being PlayStation as a box, but PlayStation games everywhere. And so, you know, that's the thing, is that as much as we enjoy PlayStation, if you're a fan of PlayStation, if you're a fan of consoles, I'm sure that might upset you when, say, PlayStation 6 isn't a traditional console, or PlayStation 7, so on and so forth. We don't know what the long-term future is going to look like. But, you know, when people say death to consoles or this, that, and the other, it's like we've been saying, Microsoft and Sony, they've been preparing for that future, but they're preparing for it in a very conservative manner, where they're still releasing boxes, but they are very much so working on those services, and they are testing the waters with releasing their games everywhere, because at the end of the day, Sony Interactive Entertainment has a suite of worldwide studios, and people are going to pay money to play the next God of War, and they will pay money to play God of War, not necessarily on a PlayStation, because they love God of War. They'll play it anywhere. If people are willing to pay to play those games, they can be anywhere in theory, because people want to play the next God of War. They want to play the next Uncharted. Some people might not care that it's on PlayStation. I mean, it would be on PlayStation, but PlayStation wouldn't necessarily be known as hardware anymore. It would be known as a service or a storefront. I'm seeing some people say Sony's trying to distance themselves from Quantic Dreams because of the recent allegations of harsh work environments, and that may or may not be the case. I'm not entirely sure, but these are still great games. Quantic Dream is a talented developer that is more than likely going to release another great game that is probably going to get a lot of attention. I mean, Beyond was kind of divisive between a lot of people, but Heavy Rain and Detroit, they were well-received games. But like I said about 2 minutes ago, this was a conversation between NetEase, Sony, and Quantic Dream. And so because they're a second-party developer, this might have been a more isolated scenario where Quantic Dream wanted these games to go elsewhere, but of course can't because they don't own the IP, and just maybe something was worked out for these particular titles, and that's it, and that's the end of it. Sony's not going to do anything with their other exclusives. We'll just have to wait and see, but very much so, if Sony allowed it one way or the other, it does kind of show where they're headed. But anyway, let's get into Let's Talk Plus. Our weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate Joseph Giamarco. you are the winner of this week's $10 PSN code. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, but I'll be contacting you very soon via Twitter or email, so be on the lookout for that. Now, if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, very simple. Follow the link down below. You can follow on Twitter. You can follow on Twitch for an entry. You can check out my Instagram for an entry. Very simple. I'm trying to pay for your games every single week here on Let's Talk PlayStation. With all that out of the way, those are all the news stories I want to talk about with you guys from this past week. Now, if you didn't see PlayStation Vita Online, you remember maybe 2 months ago we did PS3 Online, right? We played a bunch of old PS3 games online, trying to see if we could find active lobbies, see if the communities were still active, and asking them why they didn't buy a PS4 just yet. Well, now Vita's more unique because it didn't sell all that well, and there is no sequel certainly, so why are people still playing Vita games online? Check that video out if you didn't see it already. Very fun, very interesting, and man, Vita's great. It really is. It's not a problem making a video like that, right? Because it's a win-win scenario. I get to play Vita games, and we get a very interesting video out of it. Now, for Tuesday's upcoming video, it's going to be one of two things, depending on if I get it ready in time, but it might be an unboxing, more akin to the PS3 100 Games unboxing that you saw not too long ago. I know a lot of people liked that, so I'll be doing more unboxings on this channel, more mystery unboxings, which I know people very much so like. Typical loot box culture. You guys just love mystery. You don't know what you're going to get. But you might get that, or you might get a facts video regarding a very beloved PlayStation console. But I'm not sure which one's going to be. Again, I have to wait and see in terms of what I end up getting done. But other than that, that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Badecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.